for our final event of the day, we have a wonderful panel on AI responsibility. I think we're only running 10 minutes late, which is a stunning success. If, based on my experience, most of the time at the end of the day, it's usually like 45 minutes late. So the fact that we're only 10 minutes is great. But nonetheless, I will try to spend our time efficiently. I will spend very little time introducing our lovely panelists. Today we have with us both of our invited speakers, Michael Bernstein and Alyosha Efros. Plus we have three faculty from right here at the University of Michigan, Ben Kuipers, Rada Mihalcea, and Emily Mower, Provost. Indeed. So I'll let them introduce themselves more in just a second, but I wanted to start with a pretty basic question here. I should also, by the way, introduce myself. I'm Ben Fish, faculty here. And when I'm introducing myself to people, when I say what I work on, I usually say something different every time. To you all, I might say that I work on trying to better understand discrimination and fairness in machine learning. But then I turn around and I go to some event with some fancy business leaders, some CTOs and the like. And what I say I work on is responsible AI. On the other hand, I don't know what the term means. I'm just saying it because I think they think it'll be, it sounds good. And so what I'd like to do to start with today is ask our panelists to introduce themselves and tell me the answer to this question. What do you think responsible AI means? So just, an easy question to start with. If you want any more prompting, I think we can think about what are the goals of responsible AI, how does responsibility as a term relate to other terms, but let me try to keep this relatively informal, so if you want to ignore my question, talk about something else, then feel free to. Maybe we can start, though, with just a short introduction and any answer you want to this question. Maybe let's start with Emily. We only have one mic, so bear with us here. Emily.
I should have realized what was going to happen when I chose this seat. So I'm Emily Provost, and my work focuses on how you can recognize aspects of behavior from speech. For a long time, that's meant emotion. We also do a lot of work with mental health and looking at tracking disease severity for people with neurodegenerative diseases. So there's been a lot of talk recently about emotion recognition, more specifically about banning emotion recognition, whether it has any value, whether one should ever do it, if there's anything ethical that could even be found within this entire branch of research. And so when I think about responsible AI, I'm thinking about it through the lens of that particular question. And I think it's very easy to talk about technology in black and white terms. You should do it, you shouldn't do it. It really simplifies the narrative, and so it's a very reasonable go-to when you have very, very quick dialogue. However, I think responsible AI has to mean more than what if we only focus on the worst possible consequences of any technology we're thinking about. Because what responsible AI also means is how can we think about making sure that people who would really benefit from technology have that technology advanced, developed, and considered and deployed in a safe and respectful manner? So to me, what responsible AI means is considering the pros and cons of technology, thinking about the use cases, who benefits, who's harmed, and really trying to understand how we can put guardrails around the design, the development, and the deployment of these technologies so that we can make sure that people who can benefit will, but to make sure people who are at risk of exploitation or harm are not harmed.
All right, I can see how this will get more and more difficult as we advance. So I'm Rada Mihalcea. I'm a professor of computer science here at Michigan, and I work primarily in natural language processing. I always say primarily because I'm fascinated by interaction between natural language processing and other areas, whether that's computer vision, maybe physiological sensing, or other disciplines like social sciences or healthcare. I always go back to my own roots. I guess we all do, whether we admit it or not. And I grew up in a very multicultural environment where there was different views that different people had on the same problem, maybe different ways of referring to the same thing. And I witnessed that early on. I'm witnessing that now. My lab is very multicultural. And in general, I think the whole space of AI. So whenever I think of responsible AI, for lack of better experiences, I think of what I would do as a responsible human being. And in general, thinking of what it means to put yourself in other people's shoes. So always thinking of what would others think about that, and that would make it responsible. So what might seem responsible to me might not seem responsible to somebody else. And to the extent we can do that with AI, I think that would be ideal, to have that different perspective.
Okay. So with respect to a brief introduction, I have the benefit that you heard a 1-hour introduction to me earlier today. So suffice it to say, my name is Michael Bernstein. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Stanford, and I describe my work as I'm a social computing designer. So for me, responsible AI, I actually kind of associate the semantics of that largely with a fairly specific circumscription around kind of like fairness, bias, and safety. When I hear people discuss, and so I'm not saying that's the universe of this, but when people discuss responsible AI, to me, those are usually the kinds of terms that come up next in the sentence. And I would contrast that with, say, impacts downstream on society, which I feel tend to fall outside the description of things like responsible AI.
I'm Alexei Efros, and I do computer vision and machine learning. And to me, responsible AI is, I guess, the opposite of irresponsible AI. And to me, it's really more about, responsible science and responsible engineering. Right? So again, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know what it means to do responsible science. It means to, to being careful, to not fake your results, to not train on the test set, right? The bread and butter issues. If we, I'm not looking for something very to actually publish papers instead of tweeting them out, to actually have papers instead of blogs, to think more and publish less, and to, if we go, that's on the science side. And on the engineering side, whenever you have something in production, you worry about the corner cases, you worry about test cases, you evaluate, you look at the data, you look at how it can affect different use cases. Exactly what people in civil engineering has been doing for a century, right? It's nothing new. We know how to do this. It's just that in the past, nothing worked in our field. And so it didn't matter. Finally, some things are starting to work. So we need to grow up and be like proper scientists and proper engineering and just do things by the book and not by the seat of our pants. That's to me what responsibility means.
I'm Ben Kuipers. I'm a professor here. I've been working on AI for a long time. And the focus of my career has actually been on what I call the foundational domains of common sense knowledge. Things like knowledge of space, of dynamical change, of objects, actions, and so forth. And for the last maybe decade plus or minus, I've been thinking about ethics as a foundational domain of common sense knowledge, which is what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. Now, of course, philosophers have been thinking about this for many, many centuries. And so one of the big problems was to say, well, what is ethics anyway? And can I simply pick up the fruits of what all these philosophers have done and use it in a scientific and an engineering context? And I've recently come up with what I think is a reasonable picture of how ethics fits into all of this. Ethics is about the relation between individual actions and the success of the society. Now, a society thrives if the interactions among its individuals are predominantly positive-sum interactions. Now, what that really means is that people are cooperating so that the result of their interactions is more than what they put into it, as opposed to negative sum or zero sum. So the concept comes from game theory. Predominant cooperation produces more resources, so the society is better situated to respond to threats and opportunities. And Lord knows we face threats and opportunities. Now, cooperation requires vulnerability because you're vulnerable to your cooperative partners. So that requires trust. So if you're going to cooperate, you have to trust your partners. And that's defined in the management literature as willingness to accept vulnerability under the assumption that it's not going to be exploited. So trust is very valuable as long as your partners are trustworthy. And if they're not, you're cooked. So finally, we get to ethics. Ethics is a body of knowledge specific to the society that tells the individual people, the individual members of the society, how to be trustworthy and how to recognize when others are trustworthy. Because then you can cooperate, then you can produce more resources, then the society thrives. So what's responsible AI? So responsible AI is not simply AI that is reliable and predictable. It is technology, methods that are trustworthy in a way that rewards and encourages successful cooperation among the other members of society.
Fantastic. Now we have that answered. Done. We got, I think, 5 different views here. I think, it's clear that I asked an impossible question because it can mean something different to, different groups, and even if it didn't, then it would mean, that there's too much baked into that word, I think, to have any, singular, clear definition. So I apologize for starting with such a difficult question, but I now want to get into, now that we know what it means, where this word intersects with each of your different areas. We have up here 5 experts in each of 5 distinct different areas, and given that we have really increasing interest in this area, I can say the word responsibility AI to a VC guy, and they at least claim that they know what that means. They go, I know what you're working on now. Given that we have such interest, I want to hear the juicy gossip. How has your field succeeded or failed at producing responsible AI? In other words, maybe the less salacious way of asking this question is, where do you think the biggest challenges are for creating responsible AI in your respective areas? At this point, maybe I don't think we have to go one by one, as if we were ducklings in a row, but So please feel free to jump in, given that I have once again asked a difficult question. Oh, Emily's going.
Jumping in, taking the instruction very seriously. So I've talked a little bit already about how responsible AI interacts with effective computing or emotion computing. To be more specific about it, though, there are many critiques in the field now talking about salacious gossip, and by salacious gossip, I mean news. It's accessible to all. There are a lot of critiques about the field, and they have to do with everything ranging from the scientific validity of what the field is trying to do to the significant and harmful downstream impact of deploying these technologies on the broader market. So specifically with respect to the scientific merit, one of the large critiques comes from the notion that often systems are relying upon simplified definitions of what is an incredibly complex phenomenon. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced emotions or if you've had trouble understanding the emotions of others, but they're really hard to understand, and they don't make a lot of sense if they're not contextualized. So the problem with these technologies when they're deployed is that they don't often have these contexts. Instead, they have to rely on these really simplified definitions for what emotion is, and as a result, they don't always make correct inferences. That's one set of problems. Another set of problems that also have to do with ethics have to do with unequal performance across groups. So I'm sure that you have had many discussions about this, but if there are biases in training data sets, there are biases in the algorithms that operate over these training data sets. That means that since our data sets are primarily from very specific groups of people, the algorithms themselves tend to work best on those very specific groups of people, which results in uneven application of these technologies. Not the only problem. As it turns out, when you're building machine learning algorithms, you bake your own assumptions into how you're crafting, which means that if a very select group of people are designing these algorithms, then also the algorithms themselves, independent of the data, are themselves going to be biased. So there are a lot of problems that exist with these technologies. There's a quote from a Friday Night AI that I've just repeated basically forever. I've heard Rada repeat it as well, from a collaborator that I work with. So here's the flip side of the ethical problem. So we do a lot of collaboration with people with bipolar disorder, and it's a chronic and severe mood condition that's characterized by swings into mania or heightened energy, depression, lowered energy. And it has devastating consequences for people who have this illness if it's not well managed. And my collaborator, Dr. Melvin McGinnis at the Depression Center, has said many times that from his perspective, what's unethical is not pursuing technologies that allow people to have more insight into their emotion and mood. Because for people who don't have a lot of insight, these types of technology can promote long-term health. So on the one side, you have critiques that have to do with the performance or the design. On the other side, you have a real understanding of needs. Now, somewhere in between, there's also the practical realization that comes from all these discussions of bans, which is that machine learning is really complicated, our data are really complicated, and banning emotion recognition is not something one could do anyways, because as it turns out, it's a signal that's part of speech or part of language or part of so many other things. And so I'm not sure if I've really gotten you anywhere other than to say these things are really complicated, but our fields, emotion, any field that you're in, you have to think about this really seriously. Because if you're designing technology that has the potential to make inferences about someone's state, and that state has value. So for example, I know someone's oppressed, I'm gonna try to sell them things. Or I know someone is vulnerable, and so I'm going to make this choice. Or I know that someone's emotions are atypical with respect to whatever my normative population is, then I don't want to hire them, or I don't want to grant them parole, or I don't want to grant them a loan application. You have to think about all of these uses in addition to the positive ones. Because then you can make sure that when you do think about deploying them, you're not doing it blindly in the hopes that everyone just uses it in the glowing way that you've thought about it. Instead, you think about the whole pipeline, all the way from data collection to deployment to checks to uses to recall, potentially. And that is how I think responsible AI should interact with effective computing.
We can go like ducks in a row. In terms of what are challenges that I see, my first reaction when ChatGPT came out at the end of last year was, well, now good, we have this thing that works. And so people could shift focus from maybe just tweaking parameters and doing all the work that we were doing before and putting more emphasis on the social impact of these technologies. Now that obviously it's easier said than done, and I think a big challenge in responsible AI is the interest that there are behind these technologies. What we are seeing already is the rich gets richer phenomenon. Because of the interest. We see, as was mentioned earlier today, for instance, the elderly are not really represented in the data or in the technologies. My view is that it's because by the time you get older, maybe you don't have energy to start research programs, so there are very few people who actually represent the interests of the elderly people. The same goes with those who are in poverty, right? So they would benefit from the technologies, but who is really representing them? They don't have the resources for research. So at the end of the day, I think it's the grim truth that it does come down to who has the money and where those money get. And so that, to me, it's going against what we ideally want from responsible AI, to have everyone represented in that data. I think there is a risk to get that gap even bigger, the socioeconomic gap, because of all this synthetic data being generated. And guess what? It's being generated out of data that represents certain population. And so it will just amplify that gap unless we pay attention and unless we keep in mind that there are other people who are not at the table, maybe for valid reasons, who may need to be represented. So to me, that's a big challenge that we have. Like, what are the really financial interests behind who is behind these technologies, and how to address that?
Quack. So from my area of research, it's unsurprising. Like, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Right? So my area of social computing 10, 15 years ago was empowering the creation of these things that you might have heard of called social networks that connect people to each other. And this seemed really great, and was building research to try to do this more effectively and create deeper connections, to connect strong ties and weak ties and all these things. Guess what? Some stuff happened out of that. The field just wrenched itself apart in many ways in introspecting on the role that we've played in that. Guess what else I've worked on? Crowdsourcing, data annotation, lots of opportunities there. Then approximately a decade later, the community started wrenching itself apart around the kinds of impacts that it was having on the workers who were generating that data. And so when I look at this, I can help you speed run this. I think the same kinds of things are happening. And to the field's credit, I think that there's a lot more recognition of these issues earlier on than there has been in some of the earlier cases. But I do think that this is not news, and can be addressed, as Alyosha was suggesting, by paying attention to history and to the kinds of best practices that we've developed over the last century to resolve these kinds of things.
Yeah, so maybe just continue on that theme. My wonderful colleague Pietro Pirona from Caltech, he has a very good term that I borrowed from him for my title, which is responsible AI. So I think the responsible AI community themselves also needs to think of the impact of what they are doing and make sure that their research is also very carefully done. And we have seen several examples when findings that went into popular press, lots of news and stories and blah, 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 then turn out to be, not quite right. And so I think just fundamentally, going back to fundamentals and, there's this concept of slow science. And I think it's a very good idea that in this, ever-changing Twitter world and desire to get into all the news stories, we just go back and slow down a little bit. And I think that, to me, would be a very responsible thing to do for all of science in general and responsible AI in particular.
As we're all getting older, we keep hoping things will slow down a little bit, but then all of you guys are making it speed up. So there we go. So asking about what we do or what we can do in order to achieve responsible AI, I think it's worth asking, what do you want to trust in your world? So clearly, if you're driving along and you come up to a stoplight and it's green in your direction, you want to trust two things. You want to trust that it's red in the other direction. You also want to trust that the drivers who are coming in the other direction are going to notice that it's red and they're going to stop. So you get to sail right on through. And so there's a set of regularities about this mechanism in the world that greatly simplifies your planning process. And this has been treated at great length in the AI world of the past decades in terms of defaults, non-monotonic reasoning, things that are generally true but not guaranteed to be true. So some of the specific things, and these come up a lot when people are talking about AI ethics. Can I trust that my case will be treated fairly? Whether my case is my application for a job, or for graduate school, or for bail, or for parole, is it going to be treated fairly, or is it going to be treated in some way that reflects something I have no control over? Another one is, I carry, and so do you, a supercomputer around, which collects a bunch of information, and if I get on a social network, then I'm giving them a bunch of information. Can I trust that the information that I reveal, either deliberately or accidentally, is not going to be used against me to exploit me? This is a big problem. Can I trust that these autonomous vehicles that I'm increasingly seeing around are actually going to be at least as competent at driving as a skilled and alert human being? Well, they're really good at some things, but there do seem to be some corner cases that they have trouble with. And one last issue, we think about AI and robots. So we're building AIs that run on computers that are available on the network. We have robots that move around. Some of them are autonomous vehicles. Some of them have other form factors. But we do need to realize that the same analysis and the same set of concerns that we have also apply to other artificial creatures which act in a deliberate, goal-oriented, problem-solving fashion in our society, which is to say corporations, including profit-making, nonprofit, governments, churches, other kinds of collective intelligence. And many of these kinds of analysis apply to them just as much as they do to the kind of digital computer-based systems that we currently think about.
So there's a lot in here. We definitely don't have time to unpack all of that. But one of the themes I'm noticing here is what I might call there's nothing new under the sun. The problems we're experiencing now seem to be related to problems we've experienced in the past. I think we've already heard some potential solutions, or at least suggestions for how to deal with that. I want to connect that to a very pithy line I heard earlier today from one of our panelists. You can correct me if I'm quoting this wrong, but I wrote down a line from Alyosha who said, "The problem is us, not the machines." And besides just a truly pithy line, I think there's a lot of directions one could go in response to that claim, I think, please correct me if I'm misrepresenting your position, but I think that approach implies a gap that between the technology that we're creating here and the wide world of policy, whether that is in policies around managing AI or policies in the effects of AI. I think what we're noticing here is a gap. And so my question is, given the possible existence of such a gap, you may disagree if such a gap even exists, how do we deal with that? What responsibilities do we have as researchers to interact with something beyond our immediate technical goals? Do we have any responsibilities as an AI researcher to interact with those outside of our field? Do we have, again, I'm asking impossible, vague questions, but please bear with me. Do we have responsibilities to, here's another theme I noticed, throughout the day, engage with stakeholders? What kinds of responsibilities do we have as researchers to bridge these kinds of gaps? That was like 6 questions. Feel free to take any subset of them.
So, yes to engaging with stakeholders. I'll just start there. One of the limitations in terms of having people not feel a part of AI or willingness to have their data be part of any AI system often has to do with isolation, or this notion that people just take and never give back. And so, as a first principle, yes, we have an obligation to engage with stakeholders. On the policy side, it's a really interesting question. I don't know if I've mentioned this. Effective computing, currently thinking about how to manage itself, may have come up. And we've been having all these workshops recently. One we had recently was called Moral Imagining. It was led by Google. And one of the initial reactions to something like that would be, but you're Google, don't you know how to do this? Can't you just come up with rules that you then enforce and blah, blah, blah? And the answer is no. No one has the right answer to this, and it's a thing that's challenging the entire sector. And so I used to find it really frustrating to go to a workshop and at the end have very little actionable that comes out the other side, because then you might think, oh my gosh, we've gotten nowhere. We still don't have policies that govern the appropriate use of effective computing technology. But perhaps that's the wrong way to look at it. Because if that's our requirement, every single time we sit down, we have new policies come out the other side. This is really very infeasible. Instead, perhaps we need to just slow down a little bit, have a little bit more patience, and start thinking about how do we learn from medicine? How do we learn from civil engineering? How do we learn from these other fields that actually are doing this? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are structures in place. But because we often have an AI first principle, we don't always pay attention to those structures. And so if we can actually have our policies that are guided by policies that exist for other types of potentially harmful technologies, like medicine, for example, then we can really start to think about how do we govern these deployments in a way that makes sense, in a way that we can actually work with. But we have to have patience. We have to be careful about these things.
We can just randomize a bit. I can throw it to Ben.
Well, I like the theme of looking back at cases in the past where we have seen where others have confronted similar things. And one of the most dramatic ones are the atomic scientists after the Manhattan Project. And discovering that they have unleashed a kind of power that causes a kind of destruction that was unprecedented. And they felt in many cases that it was necessary, but necessary or not, we were now subject to it. And so what should we do? And I think in many ways we're not in exactly the same situation, but we're like it. And I think part of what we have to look at as we look at the problem of jobs, as we look at the problem of having decision-making embodied in artificial devices, having decision-making that is in many cases constrained by specific, fairly narrowly defined utility measures and algorithms that are designed to optimize those utility measures. Many of the bad things that people look at from AI decisions come from an excessively narrow model of the world and an excessively narrowly defined utility measure. And so you can pick a particular utility measure and say, okay, I'm going to optimize the heck out of this in the model I have of the world. And you can do a wonderful job of doing that because we have powerful algorithms. But depending on that model, depending on the utility measure, you can do a huge amount of harm. So my poster child for this is Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize. In 1970, he published a paper in an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine, and its title was, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Maximize Its Profits." Think about that. Now, he's a very, very slick guy, and it takes careful attention to see all the fallacies in that paper. But if you just sort of sit back and say, should it actually be the goal of a collective human activity to maximize profit, disregarding other factors, then how is this going to end? Now, in his paper, in case you go back and look for it, and it's not hard to find on the web, obviously, at the beginning of the paper, he says, oh, there are these other factors, law and ethics. By the time you get to the end of the paper, those have gone missing. And it's clear that he actually disapproves of those. And really, it's profit above all. So we can embody those algorithms and that measure in computational algorithms running on silicon or in corporate procedures. And all of that, it's basically, we can apply the same analysis, and our work in AI helps us analyze those things. Have fun.
Either way. Okay, so I agree that the problem is us, I think, and it's the algorithms. So I'm totally reasonable. I can accept a position that says like the atom optimizer is sufficiently distanced from the kinds of applications that it would be very hard to assign moral responsibility to an optimizer. At the same time, as we get closer and closer to direct applications, which may be kind of the difference in maybe the research areas, or it might be the applications you're working on within your research area, I think we do start to embed more and more politics into the artifacts, to sort of pseudo quote Langdon Winner here. And that's where I think it becomes that we are reifying sort of our social world into the things that we're building, which is, you know, inevitable, but it's also where I think those responsibilities arise. I think there are things at the university and so on that can help, but they also have some really, really big limits. So for example, when you're like, university, ethics, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Someone just shouted out, it's 3 letters. IRB, great, guess what? It's not going to help you here. By federal regulation, IRBs are disallowed from considering societal consequences in their evaluation of the work, which is why most AI research is completely not, it's not that IRBs don't want to talk about it, it's just literally by code, they're not allowed to consider that, and it's considered not reviewable. So if we want to actually deal with this, we have to also build up new structures. This is why I wound up creating, along with some colleagues at Stanford, this Ethics and Society Review as a kind of parallel piece to the IRB at Stanford. This ESR ends up trying to bring together a multidisciplinary panel of faculty from the humanities, social sciences, engineering, et cetera, medicine, to help think up front, rather than when you're writing that paragraph the night before the NeurIPS deadline, what are the possible risks of the work, and what do you do about it? It's really easy. The first time we did this, actually, everyone wrote a thing that said, here's the risks and here's why they don't matter, or like, why it's okay anyway. But over time, what's sort of evolved, which has been interesting, has been, like, kind of think of it as a three-step process. You start by saying, what is the risk? And step two, you have to say, okay, so what should the norm in the field be around this risk? Okay, so we have to face these issues around, undesired, I can point a little camera at you and like detect your emotional state or something, like, right? Disclosure, third-party disclosure, and so on. So what should the field, what ought we to do about that? And what's the principle we ought to follow? And then say, how did I implement that in my research? We found out that basically, first of all, it was incredible. We basically made this a requirement of applying to seed grants on campus for the Human-Centered AI Institute. So yet we added like a brief statement. And so we were basically adding red tape, but no one asked me to take it away, which was really surprising to me. And about half of people said it ended up, even that little statement ended up shaping the research direction they were going, which again really surprised me. So I was expecting to sort of try this once and then say, hell, and they would tell me, okay, nice try, Michael, all right, see you later, and I'd get my time back. But in fact, that's like, it's continued. We've now are in our 4th or 5th year of running this ESR on campus attached to these HAI grants, and it's been really effective and people want it around. So I think there is a space to actually develop new structures here and that they can really help. I'm the last person who'd want to add more red tape to the procedure of doing research, but I think that reading between the lines, a lot of researchers on campus, especially graduate students who feel very caught up in the Twitter wars as you're sort of talking about it, feel terrified that they're going to try to share their work and then the next day someone's going to basically say, that was really problematic what you did, and they would have liked to have gotten that feedback a long time ago. So I think that there's some ways that we can help both mentor and then structure the processes around our research.
I can take you, so I leave Alyosha the punchline since you started with the quote. Just to follow a little bit on what Michael has said, one of my recent favorite books is Earth for All, which essentially takes a look at humanity and trying to predict where we'll go with different simulations. And one is if we continue business as usual, what's going to happen? Another, if we change course, and there are certain treatments that will be applied to this simulated world. And what I really like about that is it is really looking at the underlying factors. So for instance, one of them is gender inequality. And you think, well, what does all these big problems that we have, like climate, have anything to do with gender inequality? But if you think about it, actually there is a lot of connection, right? So if, say, women win more, then they educate their children, then there will be maybe less numerous families, there will be more resources and so forth. So it's really an underlying factor. And since I read that book, I often think about that view in AI. I'm not saying that thinking about algorithms or data is shallow. I think that's really what we do on a daily basis, but really think about the underlying factors. So what would be those underlying factors that would steer course so we have AI moving on the right direction towards having responsible AI? I actually think that who is building this AI is one of those underlying factors, so really paying attention to who is at the table, who are we educating as the next generation. I think that's a big one. So eventually it will be about us, not about them, the machines, but with the view that it's about what are we really putting as in the solutions, in the how we create data sets, how we select data, and so forth. So.
Punch us.
Well, I wanted to formulate something that I've been thinking about this for a long time. I think it's a very good question. What can I do as a researcher and as a human being. And I think it's a difficult one, and it's because I do feel like, you know, things are like there is this divergence. On one hand, there is, you know, technical progress that is exciting and interesting and fun, and finally things are working that haven't worked for decades, and it seems like things are getting better. And at the same time, in a lot of the world, things are actually rapidly getting worse. You know, democracy is not, you know, there's no end of history. In fact, you know, democracy is in retreat. Dictatorships everywhere are rising up, and you know, are we somehow? Is there a connection? Maybe, you know, having all these social networks that maybe has been somehow influenced some of the things that we're seeing, and you know, the rise of Putin for me as a Russian is particularly painful. And I don't have an answer. I think maybe more narrowly as a scientist, I try to take inspiration from, you know, the bygone eras. If you look at some of the older work, you know, mathematicians, like just even the titles of the papers, you know, even in the 70s, you know, the computer vision papers were on certain properties of projective geometry, right? It was humble. It was not like the goal was not to claim great successes, because in a sense, it might be that it's our fault that all of this AI is being misused, because we make it sound like all the problems have been solved by having these shouty titles and you know, successes and beautiful images, right? Maybe what we should do, and what I try to do, is just to have a very long limitation section. Try not to oversell the work, right? Because a lot of these times, you know, you name something autopilot, and people assume that it's an autopilot, but it's not an autopilot. It's a driver assistant, right? So it's not about the technology. It's not about the science. It's about selling the science in completely the wrong way. So maybe if we can just humble down and not sell our work, but more like the 19th century mathematicians, humbly present it with a long list of reasons why it sucks. You know, maybe then people wouldn't be jumping on it so fast, and then we will have time and space to figure out all the corner cases and figure out, you know, how to make it safe and useful. So I think that's maybe where we can really be, you know, proactive. And I understand that there are some pressures, you know, a deadline, you know, a reviewer too is going to not like your paper if it's not shouty enough. But, you know, you can play games. I used to play games back when I started. You know, you couldn't publish a Neurus paper if you didn't have a graphical model in Figure 1, right? Because it was the fancy thing. So I would have the graphical model in Figure 1 for submission, but then I would take it away for the camera rating. So, okay, if you want to be shouty for submission, go ahead. But just before you publish the paper, just, you know, humble it down a little bit.
Limitations are all you need.
Yes.
I'll only add that I was helping my wife in grad school study for her qual exams in political science, and there the titles of the famous books she had to study were things like The Trouble with Europe. So it's possible that it can get worse.
Thank you. So speaking of keeping us humble, I thought we'd end today by taking questions from the audience. Now is your chance to hold their feet to the fire, as it were. Any questions on anything we've talked about or anything we haven't?
How much time do you spend thinking about bad actors, people that intend to misuse the technology you produce?
30%.
Run a time and motion study on yourself. So I can add a little, we have some in-progress empirical data on this that might be interesting. So I mentioned we run this ethics and society review program. One thing we're doing is we're actually looking at what do artificial intelligence researchers think are the risks? What does the panel think back in response might be additional risks? The motivated actor perspective, I think, actually was more popular maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I think a lot more of what the risks that people are talking about now are sort of broader, not less geopolitical and more maybe domestic society risks and civil society risks. So I mean, I think a lot, it's often an easy one to think of. Oh, what happens if an authoritarian dictator gets a hold of this technology? But I would say that a lot of what the conversation around is now is actually like empirically what I see is shifting towards issues of harms to underrepresented groups and things like that.
Maybe we should get multiple questions.
Yeah, let's get questions.
I'm glad that towards the end, we started talking about ways of actually addressing these issues, because we can get together and talk about them, and it seems like everybody agrees that there are problems and we have to address them. And I'm glad that Stanford at least has tried to do something about it. But is that enough to have kind of an optional thing that some people would pursue and some people won't? Do we need something like an FDA for any AI ML model that touches society? I know that it's going to be more red tape, but if there is no consistent regulation that everybody has to adhere to, what happens is the people who want to do the right thing would have to go through this lengthy process that would delay their grants and pay publications. And if they're all incentives is for you to not do that unless you are forced to do it. Do we need an IRB for these kind of work, or FDA?
And how do we advocate for that if the answer is yes?
Any thoughts?
I think there is a role for an FDA-like agency at some point, and perhaps soon. But I also think that we as scientists need to be thinking about the mechanisms by which these decisions, by which these technologies have impacts on the larger scale society. And that's why I have found myself ending up focusing on this question of how trust and cooperation contribute to the survival and thriving of the society. Because that says there are conditions on how a member of the society should behave in order to allow that society a chance to survive and thrive. And I think our new technology says the members of society are not just human beings anymore, that some of it are AIs and robots, and some of it are corporations. And those are individuals that are members of society, and their actions have an impact.
So the FDA actually does touch some of the AI technologies. Anything that centers on health, for example, is under the umbrella of FDA. I think that you voiced exactly what a lot of people feel. I mean, you can see articles where technology companies are like, why won't you regulate us? Please, please, for the love of God, just regulate us. And I think that the reality is that people aren't sure what to do. And so maybe the right question is, what are the things that I can do? And the answer is going to be different for people at different career stages. Maybe it is engaging people in conversation when you have the opportunity. Maybe it is there's a workshop of lawyers who are focused on drafting the next legislation, and you're invited and you show up for it. There are going to be different things, but I think that what we all have to become more comfortable with is trying to recognize that there is not an answer right now, and perhaps the best we can do is show up to the best of our ability. I have to run, but it was great to see everyone.
Maybe one last comment.
Thank you.
Quickly, we convened a meeting of a bunch of industry players and academics on these kinds of issues. The thing you're talking about, there's an entire field dedicated to the study of how institutions shape behavior. It's called political science. It's pretty cool. We should all study it more. And the one thing I would say is that across all of these different organizations, the big ones you can think of, it was less about how exactly, like what committee like green lighted the technology, and it was much more about whether the leadership in that organization actually gave status and decision-making power to whatever that organizational form was. When it was a sort of pro forma committee, they were basically had no power, but when the exec like would reinforce it and push their decisions and so on, then all of a sudden the entire organization, the collective intelligence of that organization was much more powerful and persuasive and able to actually take action on these things. It was, I don't know what to do with that observation, but it is sort of true from my observation.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Let's make sure to thank our wonderful panelists once again.